Hello, and welcome to this lecture on emotions, attitudes, and stress. What we'll learn here is that emotions are a big part of the formation of an attitude. We'll also learn attitudes always have a target, more on that later, and that stress is a physiological reaction to a stressor, and we must be able to differentiate between stressors and the experience of stress. Lastly, the most common stressor in the workplace is not the task or the duties performed or the working conditions of the workplace, but instead it's the people. People are the most common stressor in the workplace and possibly everywhere else. Let's get started. Here we have what is called a circumplex model of emotions. This is an arrangement of a variety of different emotions that human beings experience on the perimeter of a circle. We can organize the circle along two axes. On the vertical axis, we have something called activation, and this ranges from low to high, with corresponding emotions of tranquil and astonishment, respectively. It's the degree of activation. Some emotions are much lower in activation than are others. Some are so low that we may not even realize them. Others are so highly activated that everyone knows what we are experiencing. On the horizontal axis, it's called evaluation, or sometimes referred to as pleasantness, and it simply ranges from negative evaluation to positive evaluation, or alternatively, negative pleasantness to positive pleasantness. Some emotions are much more positive than others, and we usually try to minimize our experience of negative emotions. We can see that sadness and boredom and fear are negative emotions, and elation, cheerfulness, and contentedness are positive emotions. This model gives us a way of looking at how different emotions are related to each other. There are a variety of different emotions that human beings experience, but we can see that sadness and fearfulness are very similar to each other. So are boredom and tranquility. The opposite of tranquil is astonished. The opposite of boredom is elation. The opposite of cheerful is sad. And so opposite of each other on the perimeter of the circle is the opposite emotion. Now, if we look at these axes of activation and evaluation, we can carve this circumplex model into four quadrants. We have four pieces of the pie. And here in the top left, we have fearful, astonished, and sad, and those would be high activation, negative emotions. The top right quadrant, high activation, positive emotions, such as elation, astonishment, and to a slightly lesser degree, cheerfulness. The bottom right quadrant has low activation, but they're still positive emotions, such as being contented, which is very positive, but it is much less lower activation than is elation. On the bottom left, we have low activation negative emotions like boredom and tranquil and sadness to lesser degrees. We can also insert a variety of other emotions on this model. And let's just think of one, say anger. So ask yourself, is anger a high activation or low activation emotion? It's definitely a high activation emotion because you realize within the first millisecond that you're angry. So it would be in either the top left or top right quadrants here in the high activation zone, but definitely high on the vertical axis. Is anger a positive or negative emotion? Well, it's definitely a negative emotion. So we're talking about placing anger in the top left quadrant. In my opinion, anger would probably go somewhere on the periphery of this circle between fearful and astonished, probably at about 11 o'clock, so to speak, on the clock face. But there are degrees of anger. It can be so intense that violence breaks out. It can be as minor as a social snub, but it is definitely a high activation emotion, negative emotion. Our emotions depend on how they are channeled and how they are managed by ourselves and by others. Other people, especially in the workplace and at home, play a role in managing our emotions. Let's move on. There are longer lasting psychophysiological states than emotions. In fact, at the upper end of the long lasting constructs, we have a trait. This model will arrange emotions, moods, and affect. So at the very bottom in the blue circle along the horizontal axis, we see that an emotion is a fleeting or transitory physiological reaction to something. It doesn't last long, It occupies a very small amount of time on the horizontal axis, and also it doesn't usually transfer well from one situation to another. We can really enjoy chocolate ice cream and have a pleasant, positive emotional reaction to chocolate ice cream. And 5 minutes later, when we walk out of the ice cream store and we step on gum on the sidewalk, then all that positive emotion associated with chocolate ice cream rapidly diminishes. So emotions don't last long and they don't travel well from one situation to the next. However, mood does last longer. It spends a longer amount of time on the horizontal axis, and it does transition well across more, but not all situations. If you wake up in the morning and you're in a bad mood, you may be in a bad mood when you pick up your morning coffee. You might be in a bad mood when you start work. Heck, you might even be in a bad mood at the end of the day. The next day, are you likely to be in a bad mood? Maybe not so much. The moodiness tends to go away over time, but it does travel across more situations than does an emotion. The highest level here is called affect, which is a disposition or a tendency towards similar emotional reactions across most situations and most time periods. So here we have affect occupying the most amount of time on the horizontal axis and occupying the most number of situations on the vertical axis. So when we think of affect, it is trait-like and ranges from high positive affectivity to low positive affectivity, which in some cases can be construed of as high negative affectivity. There's been a lot of research on whether or not negative and positive affectivity are just polar opposite endpoints of the same unidimensional spectrum. And the evidence suggests that they are not, and that negative affectivity and positive affectivity are actually two different things. While it may seem hard for us to understand how one could be highly negatively affective and highly positively affective at the same time, in some rare individuals, it can happen. It is more likely, however, that some people are low on positive affectivity and simultaneously also low on negative affectivity. In those cases, we say that someone has flat affect. These are people who never smile, never get sad, never react to anything like normal people do. The classic video example of negative affectivity would be the Saturday Night Live skit starring Rachel Dratch, where she portrays someone called Debbie Downer, who is very strongly negatively affective. Everything that Debbie talks about, experiences, conveys, or just generally finds herself in has some sort of a negative connotation. What happens when we're around people who have strong levels of negative affectivity is it tends to bring us down a little bit as well. But Debbie can't help it. This is a disposition or a predilection or trait towards negative emotional states across most situations and for extremely long durations of time, and in her case, probably for her whole life. So now we've arranged emotions, mood, and affect on two different axes, one associated with the amount of time and the other associated with the number of situations. Let's move on. Attitudes have three different components: beliefs, feelings, and behavioral intentions. Each of these three components are really, really important. These components are formed out of our perception of our environment, which changes from minute to minute, both the environment and our perceptions. Attitudes can change from minute to minute, but usually they last longer than a minute or so. Sometimes they last for an entire lifetime. Beliefs are sometimes referred to as cognitions, which is the cognitive aspect of an attitude. If we're able to say, I love chocolate ice cream, how do I know that I love chocolate ice cream? I know it because I have a cognition, a belief about chocolate ice cream because I've had it before and I really enjoyed it. Feelings are sometimes referred to as the affective component of attitude, and so which is a conscious positive or negative evaluation of an attitude object. If we can say I love chocolate ice cream, the love part of that statement is the affective component of the attitude. I love chocolate ice cream. We also have behavioral intentions, sometimes just referred to as the behavioral component, which is the planned motivation to engage in a particular behavior regarding the attitude object. So, All attitudes have an object or a target. We have attitudes about things, about political candidates, about food, about coworkers, about cars, about music. When people say, oh, he's got such a bad attitude or he has a horrible attitude today, it must be an attitude about something. So let's go back to the chocolate ice cream example. If you can say, I love chocolate ice cream, you have cognitions about it. You know you love it because you've had it before. You have a strong affective reaction to it because you say you love it. And guess what? Your behavioral intention is to buy some chocolate ice cream sometime in the near future. Heck, you may even go and buy some on your way home from work or school. The problem is that along all of these cognitions, affective states, and behavioral intentions, we're peppered with different emotional episodes. So let's say, for example, you do go and buy some chocolate ice cream at the local convenience store. The next time you're out of the house and you open up the container and you look inside and there's a cockroach in the chocolate ice cream. Disgusting. Oh my gosh. Now you have a negative emotional affective reaction to chocolate ice cream, and you may not be able to even look at chocolate ice cream for a long time. In fact, you may not be able to say with strong gusto that you love chocolate ice cream anymore. You might say that you used to love chocolate ice cream until you bought some and it had a cockroach in it. So now you find chocolate ice cream disgusting. All along the line, we have these emotional episodes which pepper the various stages or components of an attitude. Behavioral intentions often, but not always, lead to specific behaviors. So there's a moderate to strong correlation between an intention and a behavior, but it's not a perfect relationship. So many people have the intention of losing weight at the local health club starting January 1st with their New Year's resolution. They intend to go to the gym, but do they all? No. And in fact, many gyms make most of their money for the year in that first month, capitalizing on strong behavioral intentions, which are never seen to fruition. Here's another example. Let's say you want to evaluate two candidates in a political debate. One of them makes a very offensive comment about a group of which you are a member. This produces a very sharp, short-term emotional reaction of disgust. So your attitude toward the candidate is now one of disdain because you believe or think that the candidate is prejudiced. You feel that prejudice is wrong and you intend to vote against prejudiced persons. After the disgusting comment, do you not only vote for the other candidate, but you actively campaign against the offensive candidate? The target of your attitude is the candidate, and it's a bad attitude. All of these things comprise your attitude toward the candidate. Let's move on. Emotional labor is an interesting thing. It's the effort, the planning, and the control needed to express organizationally desired emotions during an interpersonal transaction. Think about it. Emotional labor is hard work. Actors are involved in high levels of emotional labor. They must portray a specific emotion at a very specific time. Think about Disney World employees as well. Think about a costumed Disney World employee who's forbidden to speak while in costume, and as they roam around the Disney World grounds, small children are tugging at their costume and, causing all sorts of uncomfortableness for the costumed employee. Yet the employee must always act in a very cheerful, pleasant manner, always being willing to take pictures with children who may be crying or spitting up on their costume, and they must portray the proper emotion at all times. That's hard work. That's emotional labor. It's harder work when the job requires frequent and long duration display of emotions. So Broadway actors tend to have a display long duration of emotion for a 2 or 3 hour stage production. And when they get off of the stage, they're just totally drained. 3 hours of work, totally drained. When they have to display a variety of emotions, that can be problematic as well. And when people have to display more intense emotions, for example, a police officer must be authoritative at all times, but also must be ever so pleasant in the face of such verbal derision that they just cannot stand it anymore. Nevertheless, their job requires that they react emotionally appropriately. There are very great differences between cultures and emotional displays. Some cultures expect people to display a neutral, emotional demeanor with minimal emotional expression and even sometimes a sort of a monotone voice. This is common in some of the East Asian cultures. Other cultures allow or encourage emotional expression, where emotions are revealed through voice and gestures. Examples include countries like Italy and Russia. These people are expected as members of the culture to be very expressive with their emotions. A classic example of this is the Oscar speech by Roberto Benigni when his film won the Best Actor for an international film for the movie called Life is Beautiful. When he won, he didn't walk down the aisle calmly to the stage. He jumped up and down in his seat and screamed at the top of his lungs. To get to the stage, he walked over the seat backs. When he got on stage, he hugged Sophia Loren like she had never been hugged as she gave him the Oscar. Someone from Japan or Korea would probably never react that way. Their culture says that such displays are inappropriate. Now, there is a related concept called emotional contagion. This is using an effective response to suggest understanding or recognition of the speaker's intention. So when someone is telling you a story and it's a sad story, you tend to have a sad face. You're saying to the storyteller that you recognize that it's a sad story. You recognize that the storyteller is having sad emotions about the story, so you too experience sadness. There's a great Saturday Night Live skit with Taylor Swift on some sort of an interview show where the interviewers are giving over-the-top facial expressions, trying to indicate to her as she is speaking that they understand the emotions that she was going through as she tells her story. It is hilarious. Let's move on. Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive and express emotion, to assimilate emotion and thought, to understand and reason with emotion, and to regulate emotion in oneself and others. Much of one's emotional intelligence is innate and hereditary, but most of it is actually learned. Maybe it's 25% nature and 75% nurture. If it wasn't a learned skill or ability, then there wouldn't be numerous training opportunities for people to improve their emotional intelligence. One of the problems here with emotional intelligence is that it's sort of a fuzzy construct. We're still not sure exactly how to measure it. The instruments that are designed to measure it tend to have some psychometric issues associated with them. Also, we're not quite sure how emotional intelligence relates to other key constructs. So emotional intelligence may be a bit of a misnomer. If we think of intelligence as a largely innate ability to solve problems, but we recognize that emotional intelligence is a learned skill or ability, then intelligence may not be the best way to refer to it. We do know that it ranges in a hierarchy from lowest ability to highest ability. Self-awareness is the first stage. Unless you have mastered self-awareness, you cannot rise up to the other levels. This stage is where you understand your own emotions, your strengths, your weaknesses, your values, and your motives. Think about a very small, very young child, a toddler, let's say, who is having some sort of a hissy fit in a store, and the mother asks the child, "Why are you so angry?" And the child says, "I'm not angry." And the mother says, "But you're acting like you're angry." And the child, if the child has enough verbal fluency to express its emotions verbally, would probably want to say, I didn't realize that I was angry. So people who have very low self-awareness express emotions and they're unaware of those emotions and they're unaware that they're acting out those emotions. After we become aware of these emotions, then we step up to the second level, self-management. So this involves a bit of more maturity and it involves controlling or redirecting our internal states, impulses, and resources. If you're in the workplace and you go to the lunchroom and you've prominently written your name on your lunch and you go in and someone has eaten your lunch, you may get very angry. Are you going to have a hissy fit like a 2-year-old in the middle of a department store? Probably not. You're going to be able to manage those emotions by making conscious decisions not to exhibit your anger, but rather to channel it into alternative behaviors. After you've been able to properly manage your own emotions, you then rise to the third level, which is called social awareness. That's being aware of and understanding and being sensitive to the feelings, the thoughts, and the situations of others. Only after we are aware of our own emotions, only after we've attained the ability to control them, only then can we truly and properly become aware of what others' emotions are. So if someone is having a bad day and we go up to them and say, I think I know what's bothering you. Could it be such and such? And they say, yeah, how'd you know? It's because we are highly socially aware and we know that person and we understand emotions in general. At the very top of the hierarchy is relationship management, and this involves managing other people's emotions. This is the very highest level. And this is something that top leaders and organizations have to have ample amounts of. Think, for example, of an instance where an employee comes to the CEO's office and says to the CEO, that son of a gun Joe makes me so angry. If he tells me one more time that he's going to blah, 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 I'm going to punch him. I'm going to punch him straight in the mouth. A good CEO with high levels of relationship management might say something like this. Well, Bob, I understand that Joe has made you angry. Heck, he makes me angry too. He makes a lot of people angry, but he's an important part of the organization. And you know what, Bob? You're an even more important part of this organization. So let's see if you and I can sit down and figure out a way to convince Joe not to do the sorts of things that he's doing anymore. Let's help him realize that other people don't like it when he does those things, that you don't like it and that I don't like it. And then we won't have to deal with Joe's behaviors anymore, and he won't make us angry. How does that sound, Bob? Bob says, wow, sounds pretty good. Yeah, let's go do that. So you two march off down the hallway to go find Joe and have a talk with him. So now you've been able to manage Bob's emotions and hopefully properly manage Joe's behaviors. And this is what makes for a good leader with high levels of emotional intelligence in an organization. Let's move on. One of the most studied job attitudes of all time is job satisfaction, which is simply one person's affective evaluation of their job and their work context. It's really a collection of specific attitudes about specific facets of the job. Here at the center, we have job satisfaction, which is a conglomeration of various aspects or components or facets of job satisfaction. Therefore, it is a compensatory model. Low levels of one facet can offset high levels of another facet and vice versa. Using a facet-based approach to job satisfaction can obfuscate diagnostic areas of concern. One person may have low satisfaction with one facet and another have low satisfaction with a different facet, but both have the same overall score on or level of job satisfaction. These facets include, but are not limited to, the job content, which is the list of duties and tasks that one performs as part of their job. Some jobs have pleasant content, like a loan processor, and others have unpleasant content, like a mortician. Another key facet is satisfaction with one's supervisor. This is very important because many a toxic boss has run off an employee. A strong devotion to one's boss can make a bad job good. Another facet is satisfaction with coworkers. Have you ever had a job where you could not stand one or more of your coworkers? Have you ever had a job where you didn't really like the company or the pay was not so good, but you loved your coworkers? Another facet is the working conditions. Some jobs are inside nice air-conditioned offices and others are outside come rain, sleet, or snow. Some jobs are more dangerous than others. Those are all part of the working conditions. We cannot forget the facet of satisfaction with pay and benefits. Few of us would work even the most fulfilling, fun job in the world if we didn't get paid. Companies that underpay lose good employees quickly. Despite companies' efforts at pay secrecy, there is almost perfect pay information out there. If your job pays horribly, then even the best boss, coworkers, content, and conditions cannot offset that. The last facet of concern for us is career progress. Many applicants ask interviewers how likely it is that they can rise up to higher levels in the organization. For some people, this is an important thing that they seek, and they will endure dissatisfaction in all of the other facets if they could be allowed to rise the corporate ladder. For others, such ambition is not important, and some of the other facets are what they desire. The relationship between job satisfaction and job performance is sort of reciprocal. One causes the other, and then that one causes the first one, and it goes in a sort of a circle. We know that happy workers are somewhat more productive workers, but we also know that a general attitude is a poor predictor of specific behaviors. Here we're referring to what's called the specificity matching principle. Specific behaviors include showing up to work on time or getting your TPS report in by 5 o'clock on a Friday. General behaviors include task performance or organizational citizenship behavior. A general attitude like job satisfaction may be only very, very weakly related to those very specific behaviors, but it is usually strongly related to general behaviors. We also know that job performance affects satisfaction, especially when contingent upon or depending upon the rewards that we receive. So the combination of high levels of job performance and high rewards will make us happy with the job. However, job satisfaction and general motivation have very little effect on jobs over which we have very little control. Think of an assembly line, for example. On an assembly line, you may not like your job so much standing there by the conveyor belt doing the same thing time after time after time, day after day, month after month, year after year. You may not really enjoy that very much, but you tend to be able to perform that job well. So in certain jobs, there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever between job satisfaction and job performance. And we also know, of course, that job satisfaction and customer satisfaction are related. So if we are happy with our jobs, customers tend to be happier with the jobs that we perform for them, and customer satisfaction and profitability are very strongly positively correlated. So just in general, job satisfaction affects our mood, which leads us to engage in positive behaviors towards customers. When we have high levels of job satisfaction, we also tend to have lower levels of employee turnover, resulting in a more consistent and familiar customer service. When the employees are happy, they tend to not quit the job. If the customers tend to interact with the same employee time and time again, then most customers are pleased to not have to deal with new employees every time they go back to the company. Let's move on. When we're dissatisfied, we have 4 different reactions which are captured by the EVLN model. This model is not a hierarchy. One can experience any of these responses or multiple responses simultaneously, or they can progress from one to another in any order. There are 4 different options that we have when we are dissatisfied with our job. The first is called exit. With this option, we can leave the situation or we can quit or transfer. So maybe we don't like what we're doing in our job and our job just does not make us happy. We can quit and go to work for another company doing something else. Maybe we talk to the supervisor and say that we're not really happy doing that and ask if there's something else that we could do for the company. That would be a transfer. Another option would be voice. With the voice option, we can seek to change the situation. We can engage in problem solving, and we can use our actual voice and actually complain. For example, if we're unhappy because of a policy that our organization has, we can ask to have it changed. If we have problems with customers on our outside sales territory, we can ask for a new territory. Sometimes we might even build a coalition of coworkers experiencing the same thing, and together we go and complain about a policy or whatever. Loyalty involves just patiently waiting for the situation to improve. And some people will choose this as an option when they're dissatisfied with their job. They say, in essence, well, it's not going to be this way forever. If I hang in there, things will change, and it's worth hanging in there, so I'll just remain loyal to the organization. This is the non-active approach. Exit, voice, and the next one, neglect, require action. Loyalty does not. The last option in the EVLN model is neglect. With neglect, you can begin to do a very poor job. This decrease in job performance may be conscious or unconscious. Another form of neglect is an increase in absences. Sometimes we cannot stand our jobs so much that we just call in sick when we're not really sick. With neglect, we may perform the job more carelessly, we may be tardy, we may just generally tend to neglect what it takes to do the job well. Now here's an example from popular culture. Many of us have probably seen the classic movie Office Space. We have several characters in this movie who are dissatisfied with their jobs. And one of them is the character played by Jennifer Aniston from the TV show Friends. She's a waitress at the local restaurant, and so when she gets very dissatisfied with her job, very dissatisfied with her boss, she flips him off with a middle finger and quits on the spot. That's exit. In that movie, an example of voice would be the character of Milton. He's dissatisfied with many facets of the company operation, like being moved from worse office to an even worse office time and time again. He's particularly dissatisfied with his missing red stapler. He often expresses his concerns to anyone who will listen, but no one ever does. So he's engaging in voice. Then there's loyalty, portrayed by the characters of Samir and Michael Bolton. They're dissatisfied software programmers who simply do not enjoy their job, the company, or the way they're treated. However, they just seem to be riding it out, keeping silent and somehow hoping miraculously for conditions to improve at some point in the future. So they're showing loyalty, that is, for a time, until they decide to swindle the company out of money. Lastly, we have neglect, personified by Peter, the star of the movie. He's extremely dissatisfied with his job, so he just starts showing up whenever he feels like it. He's very apathetic about his performance. He refuses to answer his boss's phone calls. He takes naps at his desk. So he's engaging in neglect. Different people choose different ways of dealing with dissatisfaction. Let's move on. Let's turn to another important attitude that is also well studied, and that would be organizational commitment. Organizational commitment is really comprised of three different dimensions, and this is also not a hierarchy. These are three independent dimensions which are at least lightly but positively correlated with each other. Affective commitment is the emotional attachment or identification with or involvement in an organization. If you could make the following statement, I love my company, you're expressing affective commitment. You strongly identify with the company. You have a strong emotional attachment to it, and you're likely to be heavily involved in the organization. The second dimension is continuance commitment. This is a calculated attachment based primarily upon self-interested motives. Here, we calculate that it's simply too costly to leave. So we might say to ourselves, for example, I hate this job, but there aren't a lot of other options right now. A lot of people are losing their jobs. It's a rough economy out there, so I'm going to stay here. You have calculated in that the cost of leaving is just not worth it. You may not be able to find another job, so you will remain somewhat committed to the organization. The last component is called normative commitment. This is when you think or feel that you have an obligation to remain with the organization, largely because it's just the right thing to do. Some families kind of instill this in their children. They say, in this family, we never quit. When we start something, we finish it. That would be normative commitment. You gave the company your word that you would do the job, so you will see it through. Now, you can have varying levels of affective, continuance, and normative commitment, and they may change over time. sometimes as a result of company policies. However, there is a predisposition that involves personality traits to engage in certain levels of commitment. There are also a variety of organizational manipulations and interventions which can improve commitment for some employees. They include having clear grievance procedures, treating people with dignity and respect, clearly linking pay to performance, being transparent with decisions, etc., etc. These can all improve commitment at least a little bit for most people. Again, though, there is a tremendous dispositional influence on commitment, and we cannot change people's dispositions or personalities except maybe over the course of a couple of decades. So some people will simply never be committed to an organization no matter what. Much of commitment comes from within us, but most of it is a result of organizational policies. Let's move on. Stress is an adaptive response to a situation that is perceived as challenging or threatening to a person's well-being. Here we have what is called the general adaptation syndrome, developed by Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, who says that there are 3 stages that we go through as we try and cope with stress. The green line here is the normal level of resistance, and it's different for everybody. The green line might be up high for one person, and it might be way down near the bottom for someone else who just cannot deal with any amount of stress. And the green line for others is up near the top of the vertical axis. And this is where these people can deal with anything. Nothing phases them. So the green line is different for everybody. That is, levels of resistance vary from person to person. The path of the red line, to be shown in a minute, is different for everyone also. Some people don't dip below their normal level of resistance very much. Some dip a little bit, but not for very long. That is, they enter the resistance stage quickly. Some have a much longer stage 2. Others have a very short stage 2, and so they may enter stage 3 right about at the midpoint of the horizontal axis. Let's look at those stages. The first stage is an alarm reaction stage that involves basic physiological responses. It's very short in duration. If we put time on the horizontal axis, and we start with time 0, and as we experience a stressful situation, we have a physiological response to it. Initially, our ability to cope with stress is diminished and drops below the green line, which is our own natural ability to deal with stress. For example, let's say we have a boss who comes into the office and starts screaming at us. Within the first few seconds of this experience, we have a physiological reaction. We may start sweating a little bit. Our heart starts to race a little bit. Sometimes we're just so shocked that we cannot say anything. We think to ourselves, what the heck? I've never had somebody scream at me like that in the workplace. What do I do now? This is the proverbial deer in the headlights, who freezes when crossing the road and encounters a car with its headlights shining brightly and heading their way. They freeze instead of scurrying across the road to safety. Stage 2 is the resistance stage. In the resistance stage, we tend to increase our ability to cope with stress. So this red line goes from a negative ability in stage 1 up to a positive one, and we start to think to ourselves, well, this person is sort of a volatile person, and I had a feeling they were going to act this way before, so it doesn't bother me too much. I can handle this. I can cope with this level of stress. Eventually, after going through this stage of resistance for an exceedingly long time, we enter the exhaustion stage. This, of course, if left unchecked and unresolved, can result in long-term physiological and psychological damage. This is where we actually start to experience burnout and other things like that. Let's move on. Not all stress is bad. We have something called Eustress, and we have distress. On the vertical axis, we have performance level, and the horizontal axis is the amount of stress. As we progress from the origin of this graph and encounter more and more stress, we start to have higher levels of performance to a certain point. There's a point where the stress level approaches diminishing returns. And so at a certain level for everybody, the stress level becomes so great that it decreases our performance level. Think, for example, about a tight deadline on the submission of a report. A lot of us work better under some sort of a deadline, so by giving us a deadline, that allows us to set a series of goals for ourselves. We need just a little bit of a goal and a little bit of stress in order to perform at a high level. But if the deadline for submission of the report is unrealistically soon, that might be so much stress that we actually perform very poorly. If the stress level is way out towards the end of this horizontal axis, then we have too much stress and we have near zero performance level. So this vertical line separating the eustress region noted as E and the distress region noted as D varies for everybody. It might be to the left and it might be to the right for different people. And the shape of the red curve up to the point of diminishing returns might be differently shaped for everyone as well. For some people, the decline or performance may not be so steep. Maybe it's drawn way out, nearly flat for a long time until finally the stress becomes insurmountable and it just crashes down to the horizontal axis at the point of 0 for performance level. So some stress is good, but too much stress is bad. Let's move on. Sexual harassment is a serious source of stress for employees. Sexual harassment is defined as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature having a detrimental effect on the work environment or job performance. However, for it to be illegal, its required conditions are either severe or pervasive. For example, if an employee has a naked picture on the screen of their computer for a fleeting second and someone sees it, it may be considered unwelcome, and it may have a detrimental effect on the work environment, but it may not be severe. If the employee, on the other hand, watches pornographic movies at lunch in their cubicle with the sound turned up, then that would generally be severe. Of course, this is open to what they call the reasonable person approach, and that's why we have judges, juries, and lawyers to decide those things. While watching porn movies at work might be severe, and if they watch these things every single day, that would also be pervasive. If an employee asks another employee on a date and is declined and never asks the employee again, then it is not sexual harassment. If the employee, however, pesters the other employee for a date day after day after day, even after being told no, and please do not ask me again, then that might be pervasive. Sexual harassment must be severe or pervasive. It must be strongly aversive or persistently applied behavior to be considered sexual harassment. Now, there are two types of sexual harassment, two types: quid pro quo and hostile work environment. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is when employment or job performance is conditional upon the performance of an unwanted sexual act. This is when an employee says to another employee, "If you don't do X or Y sexually for me, you'll be fired." Or, "If you don't have sex with me, you'll be fired." Well, that would be quid pro quo. That's something for something there, and that is clearly illegal. Even if only offered once or stated once, that would likely be severe. Now, the hostile work environment is a sexually intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. This would be like a mechanic's garage that posts nude centerfolds all around, and there might be a few women in the work environment who simply find that objectionable, as most reasonable women would. That might qualify as a hostile work environment. That could be taken to court because employees are protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because sexual harassment is thought of as a form of sexual discrimination and is against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to discriminate against people based upon their sex. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 only allowed for trial by judge. Additionally, it did not allow for compensatory or punitive damages. Sure, You could get the pay that you would have been paid if you had been hired when you applied, but refused to engage in sexual activity for a job. And the judge could also force the company to hire you. Well, that's fine and dandy, but who really wants to work at a company where they were sexually harassed? The Civil Rights Act of '64 was updated by the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which then allowed primarily for two basic differences. Now, you can have a trial by jury. That is a trial of your peers. And so if this was some sort of racial discrimination in hiring or sexual harassment, then you would have a trial of jury by your peers, people who may be like you and who may have experienced what you experienced. And the second major change that the Civil Rights Act of 1991 allowed was for compensatory and punitive damages. So now you could be paid back pay in the case of discrimination upon hiring, but in the case of sexual harassment, the judge and the jury could send a very strong message to the company and everyone else that we don't allow that sort of thing. And the company must pay both compensatory and punitive damages, which can be extraordinarily expensive. Sexual harassment is a really big issue in the workplace. It's something that should never happen, and companies typically have a very strict policy against it. They should all have some sort of a procedure for reporting it in the employee handbook or the policy and procedure manual, and these things should be followed very, very strictly. There was a classic court case known as Meritor Savings v. Vinson. In this case, in a nutshell, a man and a woman had a consensual sexual relationship, and the relationship ended, which is why we should probably never have relationships with coworkers because, frankly, most of them don't work out. But anyway, this relationship ended, and then the woman applied for a promotion and was denied the promotion and thought perhaps that it was because she was being discriminated against because of her refusal to engage in the formerly consensual sexual relationship. Well, she sued the company, and the company said, "We didn't even know you guys were having a relationship, so how can we be held liable for this?" The court said, "Aha, you must be aware of what your employees are doing, and you are liable for damages." This has given rise to policies in companies where if you engage in a romantic relationship with a coworker, you may be required to report that relationship to the Human Resources Department. There was a classic TV episode of the Office TV show where Michael Scott was having a relationship with his supervisor. And she brought him to HR and had him sign some paperwork acknowledging that they were having a relationship. He, of course, idiotically referred to it as the so-called love contract. He thought it was a contract that she was making with him, when actually she was just abiding by the policy of the company, which required that she report those sorts of things. Let's move on. There are a variety of individual differences in one's ability to deal with stress. People have different threshold levels of resistance. So if you recall the horizontal dashed green line from Hans Selye's general adaptation model, that particular green line may be very low for some people and very high for others. And these things just differ for different people. We also have different coping strategies. Some people have developed a network of people who help them deal with stress. Maybe it's a romantic partner or spouse, a parent, a member of the clergy that you rely on. We all have different coping strategies. Some coping strategies tend to make matters worse, like relying upon alcohol to deal with stress, which has never been a good strategy for anybody. Some people find that it helps them deal with stress in the short term, but in the long term, it always has adverse consequences. Some people just have different personality or competency differences. These particular competency differences involve different knowledge and skills. Some people have learned how to deal with stressful issues. They know how to deal with things. They have the skills that help them deal with stress. Others simply have a natural optimism. If you think about our discussion on positive affectivity, people who are naturally optimistic, people who are a glass half full sort of person, tend to deal fairly well with stressful situations. For example, they may encounter an auto accident on their way home from work, and they get out of the vehicle and they say, gosh, at least nobody was hurt. That stressful event may evoke an entirely different reaction from someone who has no natural optimism and has a strong negative affective disposition. The negatively affective person might jump out and scream and flail about and say, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me next? Everything in my life is going wrong. That sort of person does not deal well with stress. There is also personal resiliency. Some people just bounce back better than others. And this is likely some sort of conglomeration of other traits, perhaps high levels of extroversion and emotional stability, a strong internal locus of control, a tolerance for ambiguity, and high levels of self-esteem. These things all tend to comprise personal resiliency. People who think highly of themselves look at stressful situations as just a short little downturn in the trajectory of their life, or a small nick in their armor that can be easily mended. People who have high levels of emotional stability tend not to experience emotional reactions too strongly, so they don't have a lot of anxiety about stress. An internal locus of control would suggest that people who experience stress say to themselves, well, I'm the master of my domain. I can handle this. This is just something that life has thrown at me. It's a curveball, and I can handle it. Additionally, we have something called type A behavior. Type A behavior involves being fast-paced and fast-moving and hard-charging. There are people who have behavioral indicators like walking fast or talking fast or finishing other people's statements for them. These are type A people. Type B people are really more laid back. They tend to deal better with stress. Type A people tend to experience more cardiovascular health issues. They tend not to deal as well with stress, and type A behavior people tend towards workaholism much more strongly. Workaholism is a real issue for type A people, and workaholics tend not to deal with stress as well as people who are maybe not so workaholic. Let's move on. Here is a model of the job burnout process. What we have is a variety of interpersonal and role-related stressors, which cause us to proceed through a series of stages that we will cover. These stages lead to negative physiological, psychological, and behavioral consequences. Most of the stressors in our job are interpersonal. Most of the stress in our job comes from other people, not from the duties that we perform in our job. It's the people we work with that cause stress in our life. As we go through the model and each of these stages, there is a horizontal arrow leading from each stage to the green box of consequences. If the burnout process stops at the first stage, then its impact on the negative consequences will likely be weak or average. For some people, it will be moderate or strong, but on average, it will be weak. If the burnout process stops at the second stage of burnout, then the impact will likely be moderate. Again, that is on average. For some people, the impact of proceeding to stage 2 and stopping there will be weak, and for others, it will be strong. But on average, it will be moderate. If the burnout process proceeds all the way to stage 3, then the likelihood of having negative consequences is almost a certainty, and its impact can be characterized as strong. Let's look at these stages. At stage 1, we have emotional exhaustion. This is sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue. We simply just don't care anymore. We've given the job all that we can, and things are not getting better. The job is stressing us out, so we just give up on caring. That's unlikely to lead us to very pronounced physiological, psychological, or behavioral consequences. Stage 2 is the cynicism stage. It is sometimes known as the depersonalization stage, where we tend to treat people like objects and we have total indifference towards them. Then we're more likely to experience some negative consequences. An example of cynicism would be like nurses who no longer refer to patients by their names, but rather by their maladies. To a nurse experiencing cynicism, it's no longer Mrs. Smith with a broken leg, but instead it's the broken leg in room 324, or it's the gastric bypass surgery in 278, and no longer are these even human beings. Stage 3 is known as reduced efficacy. Sometimes this is referred to as reduced personal accomplishment, and with this we tend to have exceedingly diminished confidence in our personal abilities. If we proceed to stage 3, reduced efficacy, then we are likely to have a very strong physiological, psychological, or behavioral consequence. Think about a job that has a very strong burnout rate, like prison guard. In the beginning, a prison guard might care mightily about the prison and the prisoners, but eventually they no longer care about the job. They no longer care about the prisoners. They stop referring to them as inmate Smith, and now they're inmate A2178. And now they even begin to believe that they can't do the job anymore. In fact, the job is killing them, and they start to experience cardiovascular distress, weight gain, all sorts of psychological issues like depression. They hate their job, and they begin to perform the job poorly. They have severe behavioral consequences. Perhaps they forget to lock up one of the cells, and maybe an inmate kills another inmate because of this oversight, because they have proceeded to the third stage of the burnout process. Now, if you make it to stage 3, there's two things you have to do. You have to get professional counseling if you've made it to stage 3, and you have to take time off from work to recover from burnout. So counseling and time off can help some people recover and rejuvenate from burnout. Think about the TV show Law & Order Special Victims Unit. After working endless hours on a case about a horrible sexual crime or where a victim was just brutally victimized, the detectives are often told by the captain of the Special Victims Unit to go home and take some time off. If they've also fired their gun and maybe even killed a perpetrator, then they are required to take time off, and they're required by their job to seek counseling from a licensed counseling psychologist or psychiatrist who works for the police department. This is such a serious issue that anytime an officer fires their gun in the line of duty, whether or not they hit a human being or kill a human being, they're immediately put on desk duty until it's investigated. If they kill someone, then they also have to do the counseling thing, because taking a life is a very serious thing. If you think you're experiencing job burnout and you see yourself start to progress from stage 1 to stage 2, that should be a big giant red flag. Maybe you should seek some counseling early so you can avoid reduced efficacy or the last stage. Burnout is a big issue, and it's detrimental not just for us, but also for our coworkers and our customers and other people who interact with us on behalf of the company. Let's move on. Here are some tips for business practitioners. First, we must recognize that a person's general affective disposition plays a large role in their emotions, behavioral intentions, and actual behavior. As employers, we should seek out persons with high levels of positive affectivity. A Debbie Downer can really make things tough at work. Second, managers should be aware that some jobs that entail high levels of emotional labor can take a toll on employees. Never give an employee a role that leaves them emotionally spent. Never give a job with high emotional labor to someone who does not have both the personal resiliency and an intense interest in the job. Third, despite all of the popular and business press articles heaping accolades on emotional intelligence, it is still just a small part of the competency pie, so to speak. It is not the cure-all for every leader in every job. Until its place in the nomological network is established, rely on it with caution. The nomological network is the arrangement of causes and effects of variables in the psychosocial sphere. Fourth, if managers can create a workplace that people love to be a part of, then it can offset a lot of other negative aspects about the workplace. Of the 3 forms of commitment, affective commitment creates the strongest bond. Enhance it in any way possible. Fifth, managers must understand how humans handle stress and recognize that different employees handle it differently, and some do a better job of it than others. Don't put nervous Nelly on the most dangerous piece of equipment in the factory. Let's move on. Well, thanks. That's all for now.